Today's book is kind of a perfect illustration of how star ratings can be kind of reductive in larger book conversations. Sure, they are excellent shorthands, especially in a market where there are so many things to read. However, if you get to know your own reading tastes, you may learn that you like things that may not be as widely received. And I have learned that I like fiction that oftentimes can be a little more middle of the road in terms of general reception, because oftentimes it is taking narrative risks. And even when those narrative risks don't always pay off 100%, I still really enjoy playing in those realms. So if you like books that play with the kind of odd and speculative, are interrogating the kind of liminal space between the online and real life, have a kind of quiet sadness to them, and are kind of looking at overcoming trauma in some way, but also have a sprinkle of a really quiet romance, then you need to check out Moderation by Elaine Castillo, no matter what the ratings may say, especially as I have personally found that literary fiction tends to have much more kind of middle of the road ratings. But I absolutely adored this book. But before I tell you more about it, hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. Ideally, every Friday, we are diving deeper into a specific title, and if any of that sounds good to you, I would love for you to like and subscribe and hang out a little bit longer. So let's dive into this book, which was a surprise to me in a lot of ways. I went in really only knowing that we were following a content moderator as she was promoted into a role in a more virtual reality setting. And it is that, but it also is so much different than that at the same time, or the expectations I went in with. I went in kind of expecting an adult Heir Apparent, which is a young adult title I read in the 2000s about someone that gets stuck in a virtual reality game where they keep dying and regenerating and having to figure out who is killing them, etc. And we do play in the alternate reality in this book, but it isn't the complete and sole focus or realm that we are working in. And we will talk more about the online versus real world of it all. But also, I think if you like books like Ling Ling Huang's Natural Beauty, or even more aptly Immaculate Conception that came out earlier this year, you definitely need to read this, because it has this kind of quiet tension kind of permeating the whole thing as it is looking at these deeply personal relationships and stories and explorations, while kind of using some elevated terrors of the real world as a backdrop. Here we again are following our protagonist and point of view character, Girly, except Girly isn't her real name. It is the pseudonym she has taken on in her role as a content moderator at her job at a, what appears to me at least, to be a Reddit facsimile that is kind of further obscured by a reference to Reddit itself within the text. But if you've read this book, let me know if you agree with that. And at the start of the book, we start out very visceral. There is a lot of kind of disconcerting right off the bat, because we are throwing us or thrusting us right into this idea of what it means to be a content moderator. And for our protagonist, that she is a specialist for a particular kind of moderation that is basically the kind of worst of the worst as we would think about it. And so we are introduced to that concept at the beginning of the book in a way that's very jarring and is meant to jar us, even as it kind of tested my boundaries a little bit at first. It doesn't invite anything inappropriate into the conversation, but is kind of following her deciding whether content is inappropriate or not, but it's removing that kind of barrier of ignorance and is a reminder of the humanity behind a lot of this escalated content moderation and what it is forcing others to look at, and also introducing us to the violence of it early on in a way that's kind of disassociated from our protagonist, and the disassociation of it, especially within the writing style, as a kind of reoccurring theme of a lot of my conversations and critiques of particular voices or books, I think is very interesting in this context, because there is a disassociation that is evident, especially at first, and it's there throughout, but we start to recontextualize it. And so we start with this very kind of violent, jarring introduction where the curtain is pulled back very abruptly, and we're forced to face the violence of all of this content that lives on the internet that is moderated, and in a very stylistic, literary kind of way, but still we are watching the realities of it as we are contextualizing it within the idea that people burn out at this job very quickly and that most people cannot handle it, but Girly is able to handle it, and why. And so that disassociation is never named explicitly, but is a running theme of the book, especially as it becomes clear through the narrative that Girly has something lingering in her past that is making this something that gives her control, even as she is creating a distance from herself and potentially her own past with this control and this moderation and the kind of gamifying of it, in that she excels and meets her metrics at work and whatnot. And this excelling is what puts her on the radar of the new virtual reality company that has been acquired by this parent company, and she is offered a very significant raise in order to become a moderator for this new virtual reality. And this raise is tied to the more active nature of it, in that it will be moderation in the moment, and it's going to require even more mental energy from Girly and the other moderators. And I have never moderated online, and I've heard tangentially people who have moderated different things, I think even back to like the Book Riot comment sections, about how much of a toll that can take and the ways in which people misbehave online that we may not see or choose not to see, even as we recognize the kind of failures of a lot of moderation as well. And so there is a lot to be said about the kind of umbrella idea of moderation as well in relation to the characters in this book and the realities they are forming for themselves, which then of course also goes into this idea of virtual reality. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So this kind of gets into the millennial economics of it all, and a lot of focus is put on the fact that Girly is a millennial, the fact that she is the eldest daughter of a Filipino family who lost basically everything during the 2008 housing crisis, and she has a lot of the weight of the family on her shoulders. And at the beginning of the book, due to the nature of the work, despite the fact that it is so mentally demanding of those performing it, these characters, these people, are being paid as contract workers rather than full employees. So they're not getting benefits. Actually, I think I wrote it down because it was so egregious. They are getting 28 to 32,000 a year with no benefits to essentially view the most heinous parts of mankind. And it's said that, you know, the company doesn't want that, the idea or the invoking of that awfulness even associated with their brand, and so they're kind of paying them third party to do this job. And this idea of who is doing the job of cleaning up online and what the facade of that is. And so we have all of these different layers of the kind of fronts and facades we are putting on, because we have the idea of, you know, just the job as laid out there. We have the idea of Girly and the front she is putting on, and she is very curated and particular in how she presents herself, and you can kind of see that start to unravel a little bit more as the book goes on. And then we invite or introduce the idea of virtual reality into it. And this is where Girly gets kind of caught up, because she had never been interested in a promotion. However, with the introduction of this new role, she is offered a sum of money that is impossible for her to turn down. She names it as a figure that would make it possible for her to pay off basically the entirety of the mortgage of the family home that her and extended family are now living in due to, again, the housing crash of 2008. And this also introduces William into the picture, who is the last remaining kind of founding member of this virtual reality company. And he started the company, or helped start the company, with the founder back in college. And the founder has since passed away very tragically after falling off of a building. But there is some level of sadness and grief that is still lingering with William related to that, but we don't have the full sense of the scope of that. And it's kind of unclear at the beginning of the book how this relationship is going to go, because William is going to be Gurley's boss. And what is it going to mean for Gurley to step into this alternate reality? And so we then enter the alternate reality, the virtual reality of it all, which is presented not as a kind of like open world, Second Life-esque virtual reality, but rather almost like historical theme parks and ways to be a tourist of different countries and also history within this very curated kind of world that has this kind of standard that's set, especially within the shows. Gurley is first introduced in this kind of trial run to this world, I want to say through like a Roman amphitheater, like a gladiator style, although it does invoke the floodings and the naval battles that were acted out, which tickled my theater history brain. And so the spectacle of it all in relation to that. But at the same time, you have people coming and going, and it's an open world, and so that requires moderation. And I was fascinated by Gurley kind of talking through the different ways people find to misbehave and cause havoc, and sometimes aim to cause pain within these virtual worlds within the context of their limitations as well. But within that, we have this idea of the different avatars these characters are wearing. And Gurley is very literally given a second skin suit to put on. And so we watch her in this world, though not as much as I honestly expected us to physically be in the world of this virtual reality. And how this was going to function was one of the things I was most interested in relation to this book, because I am fascinated by the idea of online in things like books and plays, and how we kind of conceive of that and get it down in another medium. How do we distill the idea of online? And this is playing with the online as metaphor. And so we're not playing in the virtual reality even as much as I thought we were going to, but at the same time, there is something really interesting about when we are, especially as we are kind of seeing Gurley and William kind of cross paths in their day-to-day in relation to this job. We're seeing the difficulties again of the job, and then we're contrasting that with the kind of bareness of Gurley's life. We see it with her family and this real attempt to keep her personal and professional, to however she considers her job, her professional life, keep them so separate and compartmentalized. And she really tries to compartmentalize so much of her life. And so we return to this idea of the avatar and the front that is being put on, which is further then emphasized by the setting of the book itself, because we are in Vegas for all of this. And so there is this kind of element of showmanship to everything that is also kind of covering up this kind of seedier sadness, this idea that something else is lurking in the underbelly, which is definitely going on in the personal life of Gurley in this book. And there is clearly a trauma of some kind in her history based on her content specialization and some of the hints in the book. It is clear as a reader, without it being explicit, what that probably is. And so in many ways, this is very much about that internal journey to kind of stripping away all of this facade in order to move forward into the future and to claim happiness and her own life in whatever way. Again, back to the idea of simply even she hasn't given or isn't living under her own name within the context of the story. And even within her personal life, we are largely seeing that through the context of her in relation to her family and the responsibility she feels for her family, especially where it may not completely align with what she personally wants, even as the love, especially for her cousin, is completely evident. At the same time, the tone throughout this kind of is suffused with this millennial kind of cynical humor, dark humor, where there is this inability or unwillingness to kind of name what you want because of the disappointments that have been faced in the past. I don't know how to completely distill it at this point, but there is a humor to the narrative at the same time that there is, again, this sense of kind of distance and sadness to whatever degree. So even within the style of the writing, we're playing with these layers of reality and the virtual to whatever degree as well. And so while we get some other coworkers that Gurley interacts with, William really is the closest coworker that she has, and we can sense this kind of camaraderie between the two of them, or that there's something similar in them, there's something pulling them together. At the same time, Gurley has said very explicitly, sometimes to her very own family after they run into each other at a work function, and Gurley is forced to introduce William to family, that there is a hard line there for her, that he is her boss and nothing is going to happen, even as we are watching a kind of boss-subordinate relationship play out with another couple on the other side of things as well. But there are very, very firm lines that Gurley has put in place for herself, and Gurley and William both clearly have something very internal that they are working through and toward, and we are kind of clued in to what it is and kind of not at the same time. Again, we are kept distant from a lot of it until some of the reveal where things come together, but it's not full corporate espionage either, because again, it's this very internal focus. And I think that for some readers that may have been a stumbling block, especially if you're going into this or the reading of this with this promise of a virtual reality and you expect to kind of explore a literary version of this digital realm, there may be some disappointment there on this being a much kind of quieter novel than it first appears. At the same time, I do like the sense of the digital that we do get. Again, it's not overpowering, but it's thematically relevant and present. And it's enough of a kind of montage in a way where we get a larger sense of the world without spending really extended time there. We do spend a lot more time in like the back rooms of casino complexes. I've never been to Vegas. It's very obvious in this moment with Gurley's family almost than we do within the virtual reality, but we like run into William again and again, or we run into other moderators and we run into the scenarios that Gurley is facing in her work life while also kind of interacting with the world around her, whether it be the design of the virtual reality. I'm struggling not to say game, even as it is very clearly not a game, and this idea of kind of gamifying everything and what it means that this is kind of like this open source world without a game inherent to it is interesting as well. But there are these like layers of cultural exploration, and it talks in one scene about Gurley going in and there being too many pop-ups of information and it being overwhelming, and William coming into the scene very specifically and expressly said multiple times throughout the book that he never comes up directly behind her and how important that is, which is a wonderful example of some of that quieter character work and this sense of camaraderie between the two, that he can just recognize that. But anyway, Gurley, tells him there's too much going on here. There's too many pop-ups. There's too much information. And so there are layers upon layers to play with in that, even again, in a book that isn't particularly long. And I don't think the prose is, even with that slight distance, I don't think it's inaccessible. I read it very quickly. I started this at a coffee shop one morning and I felt like I was like ripping through the beginning of this book because the voice was so compelling to me, the ideas were so compelling, and the character work was so strong. And then additionally, this connection between William and Gurley became very evident to me as a reader, especially as a romance reader who's kind of primed to clue into stuff like that. And this is also where we kind of circle back to this idea of the star ratings of it all. Because when I finished the book after having a grand old time, I went back and looked at some of those reviews, and the people who didn't enjoy it cited, not across the board, but enough of them that it was a reoccurring theme, that what inhibited them was the romance of it all. Because at the end of the day, the romance was very strong here, even if it was a much subtler kind of yearning romance in comparison to a genre fiction romance. And the outcomes are a little, a little different. However, I think it's interesting because, again, I loved it in context of the book because I like romance. And I also have to, or usually will try and consider this from the point of view of like my friend Mandy, who absolutely doesn't like romance, although she can handle a little bit. And I think this honestly probably would have been, I don't know if it would have been too much for her because it was something that was clearly present if unsaid. Like there was this tension running through Gurley's point of view, and I say Gurley's point of view, but it wasn't first person point of view, which again is part of that distance, and I like third person past point of view, so I was having a grand old time. But if we're looking at this as simply a romance, I'm going to enjoy it on that level. However, I think that there was a lot of thematically important work going on there at the same time. Because especially with Gurley, we have a character who at the beginning of the book is very like stuck in a very specific life. And we see this through so many of the choices laid out in the book, like I went through there in terms of like the setting and the fact that she hasn't been promoted, and we watch her coming home from a normal day. And so there is this kind of stuckness. I'm not finding good words. There's a better word for that. It's not coming to me right now. And so for her, it is about reclaiming ownership over her life and working through her trauma in whatever way. And again, at the beginning of the book, she is pulling or holding on with this really tight control. She's not allowing other factors to come into play. She has, as a moderator, control over the circumstances, and there is a safety and protection in what she knows she can recognize, her accuracy, who and what she is able to protect on top of that. And then we're inviting this uncertainty in, especially with the introduction of William and these feelings that Gurley is able to kind of place but unable to kind of reckon with because they are something she can't control. And so then it becomes being able to move out of this kind of paralysis that she's been living in. And we see this kind of paralleled as well through her virtual reality doctor sessions, essentially wellness sessions, where she's learning how to swim and the symbolism of that as well. And so she's learning how to give up some of this control, which is directly tied in to the romance of it, because it is inviting in these uncomfortable feelings that are beyond kind of reasoning and also outside of the very strict barriers she set into play, especially in relation, again, to that like boss-employee relationship, which William is respecting as well. And so there is a lot of like that hand-grazy energy throughout all of it, because those are the kind of nuances we're working in. And I think that there was a lot of skill in being able to communicate that, to understand that longing and that yearning and that kind of repressed desire in relation to these two characters, while at the same time recognizing that neither one, for the majority of the book, was in a place where they could act on that, or where acting on it would result in, I don't want to say happily ever after, because we're not working within the bounds necessarily of happily ever after in a book like this, right? But that it would be a much different outcome if they acted on those feelings at different points in the book, if they act on them at all. Spoiler alert, I'm not going to tell you. However, there is a lot that is going on with that I think, yes, on one level, as a romantic subplot, I'm satisfied as a romance reader, but at the same time, I think that it was thematically necessary, and I think it would have been easy for it to feel like it was overshadowing the rest of everything, because again, it was such an internally driven plot and narrative at the end of the day, that was the biggest kind of upset within the interior lives of these characters. And we are looking at the juxtaposition of these interior lives with these very put upon outer representations, again, that we have thematically set up in all of these different layers that I thought worked so well. And getting back to that central kind of arc and theme of the action of the book, because again, it's much more internally driven action than I went in expecting even. But on page 29, I wrote down this quote, and at the time it just struck me. And going back, I'm like, oh yeah, this is very thematically relevant to what we are exploring with these characters, especially Gurley. It says, it did seem like a skill, maybe even a valuable one, knowing what you wanted, knowing how to look for it, knowing how to recognize it when it appeared. And I think in Gurley we have a character who has been afraid to want. And on some level, I can definitely understand that feeling. And I think it's interesting as we get to know her more. She's introduced at first just like as this content moderator, as a specialist, and then we get further into her head, we get further into her kind of opening up just slightly even to William, and we learn that she has a degree in comparative literature, that she graduated with honors, that she enjoys the verbal sparring and kind of matching of wits that she has with William, again in a very dry kind of humor. And so there was something almost kind of cinematic in the visualization of this, even with such an internal story, because you had something very intimate playing out against these larger backgrounds, and at the same time you had a lot of cultural commentary going on with that as well, with what is being shown and what history is being told, whose stories are being told, who is the content moderators, or who are the content moderators, especially as it's set out from the very beginning that white people did not last long in content moderation, but they often were middle managers. The day-to-day office politics of trying to dodge work events that aren't mandatory or that may be mandatory and you don't want to go to, or the kind of reconciling of your job and what your job may be doing on a larger scale, and kind of the dissonance of that. And so I was actually really blown away by this. It was, again, a much quieter novel. The action is much more internal. The scenes, such as they are kind of longer, but we are doing a lot of really interesting character work within them. I think that we don't get too bogged down in the details, but the voice feels so specific also at the same time. Those are synonyms in those details, and the characters are just really compelling, and I want to know more about them, but at the same time the narrative still leaves us with just enough questions open at the end. I think it's an excellent exploration on a character level and also opening up some really interesting conversations, and I definitely think that you should give this book a chance. And with that, if you have read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts, regardless of if you've read this book or not. Thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.